Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the story of a band that didn't just help invent a musical genre, they lived its absolute wild extremes. We are looking at the completely fascinating alchemy of chaos that created the ultimate blueprint for heavy metal, and at the very same time, basically engineered the near destruction of its founding band, Deep Purple. It's this incredible story of brilliant musical tension, absolutely unmatched sonic innovation, and interpersonal dynamics that were, honestly, just as explosive as their music.
To get a sense of just how deep the fractures in this legendary band actually run, you just have to hear this incredible quote from former frontman David Coverdale. When Deep Purple was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 2016, co-founding guitarist Ritchie Blackmore wasn't even there. Management had actually barred him from attending his own celebration. Coverdale called the whole thing a mockery, noting that literally none of them would have been on that stage without Blackmore. But he also openly admitted that knowing Blackmore, he probably would have walked in with a water pistol just to start a fight.
And that really brings us to the central mystery of our explainer today. How exactly did a band with such an iconic, world-conquering legacy end up totally consumed by these bitter, decades-long feuds? I mean, how do the very architects of a genre become so divided that they can't even stand in the same room to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award? Let's get right into it with Section 1, Forging the Metal Blueprint.
Okay, let's dive into exactly what Deep Purple built and where they sit in the grand pantheon of rock history. They're pretty universally recognized as one-third of hard rock's Holy Trinity, standing right shoulder to shoulder with Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. But their cultural footprint? It was completely distinct. While Sabbath had this sort of doomsday occultist vibe and Zeppelin had their own mystic aura going on, Deep Purple forged the primordial goop of heavy metal for the everyday guy. They connected so deeply with working-class fans, the clock-punching ham and eggers who wore dirty denim jackets like an absolute uniform. Deep Purple was their weekend release valve, carving a path of just sheer sonic excess. If you listen to literally any modern heavy metal today, you are listening to the direct descendants of those exact working-class fans.
Moving on to Section 2, Lord's Classical Rock Fusion. Now, what's really fascinating here is that this heavy, working-class sound didn't just come from cranking up the guitars to 11. It actually originated from a highly unexpected and sophisticated source, which was profound musical tension. On one side of the stage, you had Jon Lord. He's a keyboardist with rigorous classical piano training since he was 5 years old, heavily influenced by the smooth, refined elegance of guys like J.S. Bach and Edward Elgar. But then, on the other side, you had Ritchie Blackmore's super aggressive, blazing rock guitar virtuosity. So to even compete with the sheer punch, volume, and attack of Blackmore's guitar, Lord had to totally transform his instrument. He essentially forced classical discipline to collide head-on with pure rock aggression. So how exactly did he pull this off? Well, while contemporaries like Keith Emerson were out there experimenting with the brand new Moog synthesizers, Lord largely said no thanks to them. Instead, he took a Hammond C3 organ and just pushed it straight through distorted Marshall amplifiers. He used a legato technique, which is this really smooth, seamlessly connected way of playing, but he did it on a non-legato instrument. And the result? It created this brutal, mechanical, industrial growl. This heavy Hammond-Leslie sound literally became the undeniable rhythmic foundation of Deep Purple. And Lord was, incredibly ambitious with this. In 1973, he flat out declared that the band was as valid as anything by Beethoven. He even went so far as to compose a full concerto for group and orchestra, which the band actually performed with the Royal Philharmonic. Now, while this massive experiment definitely gave Deep Purple their early mainstream fame, it also caused massive internal tension. Some of the other band members felt these classical ideas were totally hijacking their hard rock direction. So the musical friction was working perfectly on the actual records, but man, it was really fraying nerves heavily behind the scenes. Which brings us to Section 3, Operatic Metal Masculinity. Let's shift gears for a second and focus on the microphone, because the band's academic and classical fusion definitely didn't stop with the instruments. There is actually some completely fascinating academic research out of Falmouth University that suggests frontman Ian Gillan was doing something incredibly subversive here. The theory goes that Gillan constructed his essentialist, macho, heavy metal masculinity by actually appropriating classical, feminine vocal capabilities. Gillan brilliantly combined two radically different vocal worlds. On the one hand, he utilized a traditionally female tessitura, meaning he's singing way up there in a soaring countertenor range, along with continuous operatic vibrato and these grand expressions of dramatic excess. But then he paired those feminine classical elements with really heavy rock masculine techniques, aggressive vocal distortion, a biting nasal resonance, and these fierce, almost combative call and response battles with Blackmore's guitar. If you go listen to their legendary live album, Made in Japan, specifically the virtuosic sequential vocal patterns on Child in Time or those soaring high notes on Strange Kind of Woman, you can hear this exact dichotomy in action. It's brilliant. So here is the absolutely crucial point to take away from this. Gillan's operatic style forged what we now know as authentic metal soprano masculinity, which directly influenced the next generation of frontmen in huge bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. However, academic analysis points out a really profound legacy here. This masculine authenticity was sustained by essentially invalidating the very feminine elements it borrowed from in the first place. Ultimately, this whole dynamic contributed to the excription, or basically the writing out, of women from the genre. It eventually led to a culture where female singers were sectioned off into a totally separate, gendered, female-fronted metal subcategory, regardless of the actual style of music they were playing. All right, Section 4, Egos, Explosions, and Exits. Back in the 1970s, as they were busy laying down these massive musical foundations, the band's interpersonal dynamics were beginning to perfectly mirror the aggressive distortion of their own amplifiers. That exact same fiery tension that created their unique sound began to just burn the band down. When you look back at their history, it paints a picture of absolute chaos. I mean, Deep Purple went through lineups incredibly fast. The original Mark I lineup barely lasted a year before Gillan and bassist Roger Glover were brought in to form the legendary Mark II era. But by 1973, Gillan was out, totally exhausted by the toxic chemistry. That birthed Mark III with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. And then by 1975, Ritchie Blackmore, the band's musical director, had finally had enough and just walked away to form the band Rainbow. It was a complete revolving door driven by massive egos, constantly shifting musical directions, and nonstop, grueling touring. And their real-life drama was quite literally just as explosive and loud as their music. In 1971, they watched a Frank Zappa gig in Montreux burn completely to the ground after a fan fired a flare gun into the ceiling, an event that directly inspired their biggest, most iconic hit, Smoke on the Water. In 1972, the Guinness Book of World Records officially recognized them as the world's loudest band. And then, at the massive 1974 California Jam Festival, their roadies poured way too much gasoline into a dummy Marshall amplifier, triggering this massive explosion that nearly blew Blackmore right off the stage and literally blew the glasses right off drummer Ian Paice's face. You really, truly cannot make this stuff up. But behind all those wild pyrotechnics and theatrics, the human element of the band was entirely breaking down. As Ian Gillan sadly recalled about his 1973 departure, the magic had just faded into a strict, boring formula. Everyone had girlfriends who didn't get along, they were constantly fighting with management, they traveled separately, they ate separately, and they only ever actually saw each other when they stepped on stage. As Gillan put it, once that's broken, it's broken. And finally, Section 5, a fractured, enduring legacy. So how on earth did a band this volatile actually manage to survive into the modern era? Well, their history basically became a relentless cycle of breakups and reunions. Step 1, in 1984, they completely shocked the world by reuniting the classic lineup for the hugely successful Perfect Strangers album. Old wounds seemed healed, right? Well, Step 2, by 1989, the toxic dysfunction was right back where it started. It all culminated in 1993 when Blackmore, absolutely furious with the band, dramatically tore up his Japanese visa and just quit on the very eve of a major tour. So finally, Step 3, to survive, the band simply had to evolve. By bringing in brilliant, even-tempered replacements like guitarist Steve Morse and later on keyboardist Don Irie after Jon Lord retired, the storm finally actually passed. And evolving is really what allowed a much more mature version of Deep Purple to endure all the way to today. Drummer Ian Paice, who is the band's sole constant member from the very beginning, perfectly summarized their peaceful present in contrast to their volatile past. Looking back on decades of fighting, he happily noted, "You don't have to worry about egos anymore. Now all you have to worry about is remembering the songs." Deep Purple left us with some of the most enduring riffs and vocal performances in all of musical history, but it leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to chew on. If the deep, aggressive tension between classical ambition and rock fury and the constant clashing of massive egos is exactly what it took to create the ultimate blueprint for heavy metal, can true artistic genius ever actually exist without the chaos? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.